4 billion. That's the number of records that were stolen in 2016. Okay, so think about this number a little bit. That's more than the number of people that have access to the internet by about 1 billion. 3.2 billion people have access to the internet right now. And it's roughly the same amount of people that have access to cell phones. Okay, so that's the number of records that were stolen in 2016. Going back, in early 2015, it was probably the last presentation I did as an FBI agent working in Cyber Division headquarters in Washington, D.C. I was in front of the Financial Times, I was in front of the Secret Service Assistant Director and the Assistant Director of the FBI, and myself and a Secret Service agent were reporting that we estimated about 500 million records were stolen in 2014. Okay? And our estimates were that that number would double in 3 to 5 years. This is only 2 years later after that presentation I did. Or an 8x increase from what I originally estimated. Okay? So what does that mean? You know, I'd like to say that we're winning this battle, you know, with all these tech companies and all the talent that we have that's coming out in this industry, but we're not, unfortunately. Are we turning the tides? I think so. I think we're there, but we now need to bring the fight back and start reducing this number. And you can see in 2016 we've already had some major data breaches already that are epic proportion. 4 million. This is the number, this is the estimated number of a cost of a single breach. Okay? Now, this data doesn't necessarily apply to a lot of public sector type organizations. This is mostly for private sector breaches because of all the regulations. But this is roughly about $150 to $170 per record. Doesn't matter if it's a social security number or a name or an address, doesn't matter. They're estimating about $150 to $170 per record that gets stolen will cost the company, you know, roughly $4 million for a major data breach. Okay? Obviously larger ones would change that. 70. That's the number of days that it takes from the time that you've actually detected an actor, a bad actor on your network, to the time that you can actually remediate. 70 days. You've probably already seen the other number, which is how long does it take you to actually detect the bad actor? When I started the FBI, that number was well over 365 days. So it was well over a year before you even detected someone that was on your network, let alone be able to remediate. This is actually one of the more positive numbers because this number has actually been going down. But the problem with it is the speed of the adversary has actually increased. So the speed of the adversary went from, you know, hours, days, weeks, now down to seconds and minutes, whereas we are now down to, you know, 70 days for just a remediation. Okay, so just think about these numbers, and these numbers hold true. I've been director of the endpoint detection and response team at Tanium for 2.5 years now. I deal with security operations centers, I deal with security staff, security ops, and I talk to them and I see them and I train them and I teach them and I see what their metrics are. And these numbers hold pretty static. And so what do we need to do? We need to reduce all of those numbers that I just showed, right? Our goal is to reduce that risk, okay? So how do we do that? Let's talk a little bit about some of kind of the key metric or the key ideas or the key themes that I have for today of how to reduce those numbers. Number one is visibility. This is really the core of, you know, starting any security program. You need to know what you actually have before you can actually protect it. And quite frankly, most organizations couldn't even tell you how many assets that they have under management. And I see this because I talk to Fortune 500 companies pretty much weekly, and I ask, how many computers do you have in your environment? And I've had executives tell me, well, we have between 100,000 to 200,000 computers. So that's a 100,000 computer gap. So think about your organizations in the room, probably a little smaller than that. The gap of knowledge for some of these executives is larger than your whole entire organization put together, right? So what does that tell us? Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing something bad. It could just mean that you don't have the technologies to do it, you don't have the staff, you don't have the processes in place to actually obtain those numbers, okay? But visibility is that core. The other piece of this is if you talk to companies that actually have a pretty good handle on their assets or their visibility within their environment, what they don't know is when we actually deploy our product, we have a discovery feature that's finding anywhere between 12 and 20% unmanaged assets. So even if you think you know about the assets that you have, what about the unknown assets? Right? I've seen this as high as 40% before. Okay, so this is shadow IT. Someone brings in a router or switch, plugs it into the wall to manage 5 or 6 machines. Someone brings in, you know, their own laptop from home, plugs it into the network. This happens all the time in your organizations here. This is probably more common. In corporate networks that are a little more you know, secure in most cases, you know, you're not going to get that level of access, right, to their network. Not as easily. Still happens though. One of the other stats I have here from the Ponymon Institute, they did a cybersecurity study in 2016 that I thought was really good. And they did a survey and they talked to people that were in incident response capacity. So when I worked in the FBI, that's what I did. I did incident response. I did nation-state hackers that were hacking large financial institutions in New York and the Northeast region. And a lot of the times I would get some sort of threat intelligence, maybe a hash or an IP address or a piece of malware, and I would give that to a company and say, go find this. If you find it, that means there's a foreign nation state that's likely in your network. Okay? It's very rare that I even got a response back. And there was a lot of reasons for that, but the primary reason is because most organizations didn't have the level of visibility they needed to actually obtain that information. And this holds true in that Ponymon survey, which is 75% of the respondents to that survey believed visibility was a barrier to their remediation efforts. Which means if I get that piece of intel or I find that one piece of evidence, how do I extrapolate that out to all of my network? There were many times that I gave information to companies in the Northeast, gave them that information, they might have come back with 1 or 2 compromised hosts, and they would try to do an investigation, they would maybe track it down to 5 hosts, and then they would wipe their hands clean and say, okay, we're done, we wiped and replaced all those machines. A week later, I'd say, nope, you know, China's still in there, they're still snooping around, and I'd give them another piece of information, they'd do it all over again, and this would happen time and time again, okay? And that's because if you don't have that granular level of visibility to all of your assets and all of your environment, you're never going to be able to remediate appropriately, okay? The other huge issue right now, and I think if you were here in the last presentation, it was mentioned a couple times, if you think about the average number of security and systems management products that an organization owns, it's between 6 and 10. And I've seen large banking institutions that have about 20 different products just on the endpoints. We're not even including network architecture and all the other security controls around the network. So this is just endpoint security management and security software, okay? This is very, very difficult. Not only is it a burden for the user in terms of, you know, all of those security products are eating up CPU and memory, but it's also a burden for the people that are managing these products. Each one of these applications requires infrastructure to support that, which requires full-time employees to support that infrastructure. And then you also have to make sure that all of these products are working together in some, you know, concerted effort or some combined way. This is very, very tough. Oh, and by the way, the technology changes every 2 years. So then you need to find new stuff, right? So when I look at this map, how many of you in the room, raise your hand, are purchase making or purchase decision making type people in the organization? Okay, you have a few. And then how many people are more technical operators of the network or IT? Okay, all right. So you both have to deal with this. The people that are deciding to buy are getting information from the operators, usually from doing a proof of concept or some nature, proving it out, and then agreeing on it, and then agreeing on a price, and then buying it. But look at this map. And this doesn't even show all of them. We have about 1,600 security vendors that are in the space. These are all the top ones. I can tell you up and down that Tanium is one of the best security products up here, but how would you even know, right? And how are you supposed to evaluate that? This is a serious, serious problem, okay? I don't know how to solve this one. I think over time, some security vendors it'll evolve to where, some of them will get phased out. It's just kind of, basic nature of being in this business. But this is very difficult. So that's why you have things like value-added resellers and things that'll help you determine what's best for your organization. Because not all these products are best for the size, maturity level, and quite frankly, the price for your organization, right? This is very, very difficult. So one of the other themes I want to talk about is next to visibility, which is the core. Again, that's the base theme, is focus. What I've found is that talking to a lot of these organizations is they're focusing on the wrong things. Okay? And let me give you an example. The same Ponemon Institute survey. Actually, no, I'm sorry. This is the Verizon data breach report. Are you guys familiar with the Verizon data breach report? I think that's everybody probably talks about that in every presentation. But they did an interesting new feature this year, and they took a bunch of data from about 6 major sources, and they determined how quickly industries can patch based on a new patch being released. Okay? And they found that, based on category, technology companies usually patch a new vulnerability within 2 weeks. That's pretty good. What's your patch cycle right now? It's probably more than 2 weeks, I'm guessing, in this particular room. Okay? The industries that were slowest to patch were public sector, right? Government, healthcare, education, and actually finance, believe it or not. And finance, the reason they're usually slower to patch is because they have applications they're making a lot of money that they don't want to break, right? So their corporate networks are really, really secure because they're just securing laptops and things of that nature. But when it comes to their servers, it's hands off, right? Because the servers are making money, all right? So those 3 industries, when they did the same study, they found that those industries on a 12-week patch cycle took the full 12 weeks to patch that patch, and they were only 50% patch compliant, which means some of them were beyond 12 weeks. In fact, there were some that were only 30% patch compliant in this survey. Okay? So if you're not patch compliant within 12 weeks, and you're worried about China as a nation state hacking you or 0-day vulnerabilities, you're crazy. You need to focus on the core security hygiene before you can start worrying about nation states. Okay? I know organizations that are worrying about nation states and they have the capability, the teams, the technology to do this. But it took them a long time to get there, and it took that building their layers of security to be able to get to that point. Okay? So that's what the theme of this, really the whole theme of this presentation is that basic security hygiene. The visibility is the first part of that. Okay? Focus is the next part of that, is focusing on the right areas to mitigate your risk. And then some of the other stuff we'll talk about. Okay? This is another interesting diagram. If you're worried about nation-state actors, which quite frankly is definitely a scary concept, but if you look at the actual percentage of breaches and the actual reason that each threat actor, their motive behind each attack, it's mostly financial. And you can see that espionage and nation-state type of attacks have actually gone down, okay, over time for the last few years. It's actually on the rise. It's taken a little spike up again. But quite frankly, you should be worried about the right things, right? Again, if you're not focused on the right thing, you're probably not going to fix it, but you should also understand how the threats are coming at you. The other comment here is, I feel that, I'm doing a lot of these conferences, I'm sure you've done plenty, we've really admired the threat for too long, right? We've talked about the threat, and we've investigated the threat, we've researched the threat, but what are we actually doing about it? Are you actually doing stuff in your organization to combat this? Think about what your organization is producing. I have people that say, well, Jason, I'm not a target, it's not a big deal, there's plenty of other targets out there. And I say, okay, well, what do you produce? Is your business successful? Because if you have a successful business, that means you're producing something that people want, right? That means any number of threat actors could want that same data, right? As public sector in this room, you're producing all sorts of valuable data. We just did the keynote with Palo Alto, City of Palo Alto, and they're producing mounds and mounds of data of all the people that live here. Do you think that's interesting to people? Do you think someone could sell that on the black market? You think a nation state would want to know that? Especially in Silicon Valley, all the tech people that live here? Absolutely. That is gold. Okay? So think about that when you're focusing in on what threats are interesting to you. If you don't know this, there's a lot of research out there, especially for private sector, to understand what threats are targeting what in your organizations. Another big theme here is the ability to respond faster. Okay? This is a serious problem in those same industries that I just talked about from the patching perspective. Actors are working in seconds and minutes and hours now, and we're still responding in hours, days, and weeks. Okay? We need to close that gap from the time of infection to the time you actually respond. And these are metrics that you should be tracking in your organizations. How many cases are each one of your incident responders working per day? How long does it take them to resolution? These are very, very key metrics to tell you whether you have a good team. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. 68% of the time working in the industry that I'm in, and some of you may understand this, most of the time that a security analyst is working an incident, they're spending it on false positives. Okay? And not only that, if 68% of your time is spent on false positives, your workflow is really slow and inconsistent. So let's talk about a standard workflow that I've experienced, and this is still pretty consistent today. Okay, you got an alert. Your security operations center has an alert, or maybe your security guy or gal has an alert. You take that alert, you search the data that you have available to find endpoints that may be infected. Okay? So let's say we tracked it down to 2 endpoints. We have one endpoint here in Palo Alto or in San Jose, another endpoint in Los Angeles. Okay, and I'm making this a little more basic because I usually talk global, but this is still a real scenario. We found 2 machines. Okay, so then what do we do? Well, the team locally here, we can go to that machine and we can take a forensic image, which on a terabyte drive now takes about 8 hours, bit by bit copy. Do that, take that 8 hours. Oh, well, we don't have anybody in LA. So we got to fly, we got to put someone on a flight this afternoon. We're going to fly them out, and it's going to take them about maybe 3 or 4 hours to get there. And then they're going to do the same thing, bit by bit copy on a terabyte drive, 8 hours. Okay? All right, now when we're done with that, we're going to take those forensic images, we're going to bring them back. Oh, we can't touch them because they're forensically imaged, and we can't touch them based on chain of custody. We're going to actually put them in an indexer. And then the indexer takes actually longer. It usually takes about 10 hours. Okay? And then when the index is finished, we're talking a few days, right, before we even touch the image. Oh, and by the way, it was just a false positive. Oh, and by the way, we've had 3 other incidents in that time that we're now working, right? And so you have stacks of hard drives that are sitting next to your desk with evidence stickers on them. This happened, and it's always first in, last out, right? So the stack keeps getting bigger, and you're just trying to take them off the top of the stack, right? And so this is still, even in very, very mature organizations, large enterprise customers who I deal with daily, this is still the same workflow. So imagine just flying someone to Singapore to take an image of a drive of a server that's sitting in some Singapore data center. Like, this is actually happening, right? This is, we've been doing this for 25 years the same way. We can't do that anymore. So those workflows need to change, and they are changing. There's technologies out there that allow you to do that, okay? And so that need for rapid response, to be able to take an alert, go from that alert, check the entire enterprise for evidence of that alert, and then be able to remediate and actually investigate and remediate very, very quickly is extremely important, okay? The quicker you can do that, the less chance that bad actor can actually have access to your critical systems, okay? These are some great examples of some recent threats, and actually I haven't even updated the slide since I submitted it last week. Apache Struts 2 Part Due, as I'm calling it, came out again. So Apache has been out twice now this year. And they've had plenty of vulnerabilities in the last 5 years as well. But you look at these three threats that have happened, or these vulnerabilities, and you ask yourself, what did your organizations do for these? If you don't know this and you're maybe an administrator, you should go back and talk to people and ask them what they did about these things. Okay? These were major, major vulnerabilities that were easily compromised by threat actors. Well, maybe not so much this one, but these two were easily compromised by threat actors. And it was incredibly hard for most organizations to determine whether they were, first of all, vulnerable to these things, and then second of all, whether they could even remediate, especially struts. Struts was one of the most complex vulnerabilities that's out there. And the reason for that, if you don't know, is that struts allows you to create applications that can be condensed into a single, or a series of files. And those files can live anywhere on the operating system. So let's say your organization creates a custom application that does some sort of calculation for how many, pulling back all the data from all the cars that are driving around your neighborhood, right, and collecting license plates from your citizens. It's an example. We created this custom application, we put it on some web server, and now it's running. Well, that web server is going to be vulnerable to this, but it's also the same application that's sitting on the developer's laptop is also going to be vulnerable. And oh, by the way, that application can be put anywhere in your entire enterprise and still be operable and still be vulnerable. Okay? So you basically have to do a file system search across every single device in your entire organization to determine whether or not you have remnants of this particular vulnerability that are available. Very scary. It's very hard to do. Most organizations can't do this, right? That's why it's very difficult. So think about these things. If you already had a plan for them, I'm curious to hear your comments maybe during question and answer to see what you've done during these incidents. If you don't know about these incidents and you're in security, you definitely are, you should talk to me after the presentation. Another kind of issue that you have in organizations is, especially in the security space, there's a 0% unemployment rate for security engineers in this space right now. Okay? And so that means that you have a lot of turnover. Teams are constantly changing. Things are changing in the organization. You're going to have people that are coming in as maybe tier 1 and then going to tier 2 and tier 3 analysts, etc. And the other problem here is not only do you have that changeover, but you're kind of getting that knowledge drain, right? If you don't have processes in place to kind of capture what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong, you're going to lose all that knowledge when that person moves on, okay? The other part about this is I spend about 25% of my time doing training for my customers. That's a lot of time that I spend with them, okay? And I'm just one tool in the tool shed. They're training, again, on those 6 to 10 different tools, maybe even more, and they're spending all that time training, and then boom, they're gone in 2 years, right? This is a real problem. So you got to think about retention within your organization, which is also something that I know that you guys struggle with here in this room especially. And what I'm also finding is some organizations don't even have teams still. Even large enterprise organizations, even outside this room, there are large enterprise organizations that still don't have an incident response team. They take people from different locations and say, hey, we got an incident, let's go. No more time off for the next couple weeks or month or 2. And that's wrong, right? You have to have an incident response team. You have to have the people and processes in place to plan for these type of incidents, which we'll talk about a little bit. This is probably one of the hardest things to tackle is the people problem, right? I do believe in people, process, and product, right? Most organizations can do one of those things well. They might have the right people, but they have no process and product. Kind of feel like the government's a pretty good category for that. You have good people that are trying to do the right thing, don't have enough money for the right products, and a lot of times the processes are either too much process and convoluted or no process at all. Okay? Then you have other organizations that might have all the money in the world, they bought every single product, don't have any good people, and no processes to use them. Okay? So you have to have a nice, healthy balance of all 3 of those things. Security is a very difficult area, especially for this type of people problem. You have people problems probably everywhere in every organization, but specifically now, security is so specialized. You can't just hire a security person anymore. That's what it used to be. You're the security person, right? Security is completely specialized. You need to know whether you're going to have an incident responder, a SOC analyst, an operator, a intelligence analyst, or a malware reverser. You know, these are all things that are in the security space, right? It's very, very difficult to even, especially in the public space, maybe even to find a job rec. Really, really tough. When you do find the right people, you need to make them more efficient. Again, that comes back to the 68% of the false positives in the old workflows. You need to make the workflows better, the processes that are better, and you need to build playbooks, which means if someone loses their phone in an organization, what do? Let's have a playbook for that. If someone loses their laptop or gets stolen out of a car in Oakland, because I live there and I don't leave anything in my car, what are you going to do? Do you have a process for that? It should be the same and repeatable every single time. And so that means if you have the right processes in place, people can be interchangeable to some extent, okay? Of course, you need the right products to do that as well. So the playbooks are really, really important for continuity, all right? And then the last piece is you need to track these useful metrics. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but metrics like, you know, mean time to patch. How long does it take from when a vulnerability exists to when you can actually patch that vulnerability and then, you know, actually go back and reassess. This was the biggest part that on one of my previous slides is the reassessment of those threats or reassessment of those vulnerabilities. The Intel AMT vulnerability and the Apache Struts vulnerability are going to exist for a long time. It's not just a one-time event that you have to plan and react to. This is the thing you have to do continuously since that vulnerability is released. This was the biggest thing with WannaCry. WannaCry, when it came out, everybody jumped to it, tried to investigate it, did a bunch of stuff, maybe re-imaged a bunch of machines, and then said, wiped their hands, okay, on to the next one, on to Struts 2. But WannaCry still exists. The laptop that was offline for a month just came back online. It's still running SMB v1, and now it's vulnerable. And this happened time and time again. I can see some faces here, you know, agreeing with me. You have to do that continuously, okay? And by tracking some of the metrics, you'll understand, you know, how many cases can my incident responders do per hour, per day, per week? You know, what's my mean time to patch? And this will show you whether your teams are doing better or you're getting worse. I have people that come to me and say, hey, Jason, I have the best incident response team in the country. I said, okay, well, prove it to me. How do I know that? I say, well, you know, I have people that, you know, when I have an incident, they do it. I get information back. Like, okay, well, that's useless for me. I can't even compare that to anybody else. But if you told me that my mean time to patch, we used to be on a 12-week patch cycle, and we're 80% patch compliant in 12 weeks, and we reduced that down to 3 weeks, and we're 95% patch compliant, that's pretty damn good, right? So those are the type of metrics you need to start building in the organization. And if you're an administrator here in this room or a manager, you need to start tracking that type of stuff, okay? So then you can go to your manager and say, hey, we got better. You know, we have some really good metrics around this. So just a few final thoughts, and then we'll get into some Q&A. Just kind of going back to the whole theme of this, when you talk about security hygiene, it all starts with visibility, understanding what you have. So if you're not already doing asset management, which I know is a very manual process for many people, it means you send someone to a computer, look at the serial number, understand the operating system, write down the user. That type of asset management, that doesn't work anymore. With the dynamic environments that we have, you're going to have shadow IT all over the place, okay? So visibility into all of your assets is the core of everything you do. And then extrapolate that out to things like incident response. As an incident responder, I need to know every asset that's available. I need to know every vulnerability that's available. I need to have access to that, okay? So it's the core to everything, okay? So visibility, that'll lead you to better focus. So when you have projects at hand, a lot of you are project managers, you have 10 different projects, those projects require some level of visibility into your environment to make better decisions. And if you don't have that full visibility, you're making decisions based on, you know, unknown variables, right? Think about risk calculations, do that all the time. Always calculating risk, calculating risk. A lot of those risk calculations are based on unknown variables. So stop doing that on unknown variables, have that visibility, and do it on known variables, okay? It'll make you more efficient, it'll make your projects go smoother, and you won't have to anticipate so much variation in those projects potentially. So the visibility will lead you to the right focus, which will give you the right priorities, okay? That in turn will help you write better playbooks, build your teams a little better by having that extra focus and focusing on the right things. And so all of those things put together are what we consider that basic security hygiene, kind of understanding all of those basic things. And then you can start building into things like, okay, we got the basics right, now let's work on compliance and vulnerability management. And then when you get that down, okay, now let's talk about you know, maybe threat hunting. Maybe actually going out and trying to find the threat in my network without using threat intelligence or some sort of means to give you information to point you in the right direction. There are companies that are doing this now. They actually have teams that are going out and hunting for nation-state actors on their network. Okay? But you can't get there without the basics right. Okay? So that's the theme. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I'll go ahead and open it up for any questions on that or anything else. Yeah, sure.
You mentioned metrics.
Yes.
And, benchmarks. Where can you find? Where's a good place to find benchmarks to know whether to compare?
That's a good question. I don't think there is a source of good benchmarks. There are organizations that will track things like, like the Verizon data breach report that I talked to you about for the patching metrics. Okay, so that's very generic. It says, okay, you're in this industry, and if you're better than a 12-week patching cycle and you're better than 50% patch compliant in 12 weeks, you're probably better than your friends, right? But yeah, there's not really that many places that give you really good metrics on things like incident response. How quickly should you resolve an incident? But I think that's something you build internally and you set those benchmarks, right?
But, okay, so if I could, I don't want to say challenge that, but confess that, okay, I'm not an IT guy, I'm
right.
a compliance person, right? And we're in our DNA is the need to not trust that your team is the best team in the world, right?
Right.
And so we have to find that information somewhere. Consultants?
I mean, that's an option, right? There are organizations out there that will do professional services to tell you, and they usually have a little better visibility into the actual industry that you're in potentially, based on the work that they've done. But I mean,
some kind of independence,
right?
In terms of assessing whether they really are the best.
Right. I think you also have to have a level of visibility and accurate tools to be able to kind of give you a baseline. So let me give you an example. When you're talking compliance, and you're probably doing some auditing as well, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
When you're doing compliance and audit and you're trying to figure out a best benchmark that's good for your organization, start with the basics. Start with the baseline of your own organization. Start with a single vulnerability and determine how quickly they can go from out of compliance to compliance, and start building that baseline first. Then you can start building metrics and goals to hit. Okay, so forget about looking at someone else and what they're doing at industry standard. Why don't you just make yourself better accumulatively over time, right? And start setting goals for yourself. So you can do that without any third-party help or any third-party metrics around that.
I'm not sure if I can though, because I'm outmatched. I'm talking to tech people, and when they, with all due respect, yeah, I'm talking to tech people that say that standard that you're trying to set for me is impossible.
Right.
And well, I don't know if it is or not. And so,
what I will tell you in this space, nothing is impossible. Okay, it's usually because they don't have the 3 Ps right. They don't have the right people, process, or product, probably in that scenario. Because right, yeah, and that's product part, right? Or keeping your people efficient is another piece of that. Not having the time means you need better efficiencies, right? What?
Rather than saying, here's what I want you to hit, start with what he said, the baseline, and say, okay, what do we need to do to improve that?
Right.
And open that conversation. So even when you're talking to tech people like me, okay, in order to make that better, I'm going to need this dollar amount or this extra staff or whatever it is, and here's what I can do for you if I get that. And change that conversation rather than setting this high watermark, and I'm going to tell you, I can't do that. It's not what I have today.
Right, I'll give you a good example.
I can't do today with what I have. Here's how we can work together to make it better.
I think patching is probably one of the best examples. If you just stay 98% patch compliant, you're never going to be 100% patch compliant. You stay within 98% patch compliant and you'll reduce 80% of your risk, period. And that's a pretty well-known number industry-wide. And I can basically tell you all of those 3 vulnerabilities that I showed you there wouldn't have been a problem for you if you were 98% patch compliant. But the problem with the tech people is patching is bad. Right? That's the stigma that's been around for 25 years, is when a new patch comes out, something breaks, and then we're down. Well, that's not really the case anymore. I mean, I work with the Department of Defense, and they'd rather patch first and worry about the breakages later than having the holes in security. So it's more of a concept. It's more of a theme at which that you need to bring to your organization and kind of change the mindset. Why can't you patch? Here's another example about patching. Okay, if you have some critical systems that you just can't touch, like in the banking institutions that have running millions of dollars per second on some of these machines, okay, that's understandable. But that doesn't mean you can't patch the rest of the environment. That doesn't mean you can't patch the corporate internal servers. Doesn't mean you can't patch the laptops and the desktops of all the people. But in some organizations, they'll just say, we're not patching at all, period. And that's not acceptable. You should assess the critical systems that you might want to do a lot more patch testing with, and still maybe have a slower timeline for that, but still has to be completed in some reasonable time. And then everything else, just patch, right? Patches haven't been breaking things as much as they used to. It's completely different now. And a lot of things are, if it's an operating system patch and you're running Apache struts, sometimes that has no effect at all because you're running this other application that's contained within itself. Okay, so it's just a mindset you have to change, all right? And I know that's very difficult if you're not the technical person and you have to explain this, but I guess, I think your comment was, just talk through it and say, hey, why is this impossible? And then talk to someone else and make sure that the stories line up, right? Any other questions? All right, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.